The dawn broke slowly over Magnolia Grove, painting the horizon in soft golds and muted pinks, as if the world itself were hesitant to witness the day's unfolding. The plantation lay quiet, the usual clamor of labor yet to begin, but within the shadows of the main house and the slave quarters, life pulsed with careful, measured energy. In the small quarters adjacent to the stables, a girl moved silently, her bare feet brushing the worn wooden floors. Zara's hands, calloused from years of chores, trembled slightly not from fear, but from anticipation. Today would be like no other, though the world outside would never guess it. Zara had been born into a world that measured value by skin and servitude, but she carried within her a spark that refused such constraints. The lessons imparted by Edmund Beaumont, a man of rare kindness and extraordinary intellect, had left indelible marks upon her mind. Latin texts, French poetry, philosophical treatises, they were treasures in her hands, each word a tool, each idea a weapon in a war she had only just begun to understand. Those around her saw only a slave girl, eyes wide and hands steady, but Zara knew that her true power lay not in the labor she performed, but in the knowledge she cultivated in secret. Her movements were careful, deliberate. The plantation stirred slowly, the distant bleating of goats, the soft rustle of leaves in the morning breeze, the faint creak of the main house settling into the day. Zara paused to take in the rhythm of life around her, memorizing it, cataloguing it, learning it. This knowledge would serve her in ways brute strength never could. To survive here, one had to understand the invisible currents who feared whom, who commanded whom, what words could wound and which could disarm. Colonel James Ashford was already awake in his study, poring over ledgers and correspondence with meticulous care. To the casual observer, he appeared to be a man entirely absorbed by numbers and accounts, yet his mind was drawn inexorably toward Zara. He had seen her grow from a girl with curiosity shining in her eyes into a woman whose intellect could rival any scholar. He had watched her teach herself nuances of language and literature, memorizing complex texts and translating with ease. He had come to rely on her not merely for labor, but for insight, for perspective, for truth in a world that rewarded pretense over honesty. Zara entered the library quietly, her presence unnoticed at first, yet she could feel the colonel's gaze like a gentle warmth. He was a man who measured people not by their station but by their minds, and in this small sanctuary of learning, the barriers of master and slave seemed to melt, if only for fleeting moments. "Good morning, sir," she whispered, arranging the scattered papers he had left the night before. Her voice carried the subtle authority of someone accustomed to observation, someone who had learned the art of being seen and unseen simultaneously. He looked up from his work, eyes softening. "Morning, Zara. I trust your night was restful." It was a question that, in its simplicity, acknowledged her humanity, something rarely afforded to those born into chains. She inclined her head slightly. "As restful as one can be in these quarters, sir." There was no resentment in her words, only the faintest note of pride. She had learned long ago that restraint was as powerful as action, that patience could accomplish what rebellion could not. Their routine was subtle, almost ceremonial. While the other slaves labored under the sun, Zara's work was one of the mind, organizing books, translating letters, assisting the colonel in correspondence that required more than mere clerical skill. She moved with quiet confidence, her presence a blend of invisibility and undeniable importance. Each day, the plantation's delicate equilibrium hung in the balance between cruelty and mercy, ignorance and knowledge, oppression and the quiet, sparks of rebellion that Zara nurtured in secret. Outside, the other slaves stirred into the day. Some worked the fields, their backs bent beneath the weight of expectation and labor. Others tended to animals, prepared meals, or swept the main paths, all under the watchful eyes of overseers and the ever-present hierarchy of ownership. Zara, however, existed on the boundary of these worlds. She was bound by law and custom, yet her mind roamed freely, and her intellect made her invisible in the best possible way. Invisibility, she had learned, was power when combined with knowledge. As the morning light filtered through the windows of the library, Zara allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had been brought here as a tool for amusement, a pawn in the games of the powerful. Yet she had transformed that circumstance into opportunity. Each lesson learned, each observation made, was a step toward something greater: freedom, respect, perhaps even influence beyond the invisible bars that society had placed upon her. The day began with letters, some requiring translation, others demanding careful, thoughtful replies. Zara worked alongside the colonel, their partnership an unspoken alliance forged in intellect and mutual respect. Outside the library walls, the plantation moved as it always had, indifferent to the quiet revolutions occurring within the mind of a single girl who refused to be confined by status or color. In those early hours, the stakes were not yet fully apparent. The whispers of society, the latent threats of envy and malice, had not yet reached Magnolia Grove. But Zara knew, as she always did, that awareness was the first step toward defense. The plantation was more than land and labor, it was a chessboard, and every movement mattered. She studied her surroundings with the patience of a general, noting patterns, habits, and weaknesses, while the colonel observed her with the cautious admiration of a man who recognized genius when he saw it. In the quietude of that morning, before the world intruded with gossip, jealousy, or violence, Zara felt the first stirrings of what she would one day call destiny. Magnolia Grove had been her prison, but it was also her proving ground. And in the spaces between tasks, between servitude and study, she began to chart the path that would one day turn her from invisible servant into formidable adversary, an educated woman capable of outmaneuvering those who underestimated her. The plantation's rhythm continued, but within the walls of the library, a revolution had already begun. Colonel James Ashford walked through the grounds of Magnolia Grove with a measured pace, the sunlight catching the lines of age and contemplation etched into his face. The air was thick with the scent of earth, horse sweat, and smoke from the distant kitchen fires. To the casual observer, he was simply a man inspecting his property, a planter concerned with the yield of crops and the loyalty of his laborers. But beneath that exterior lay a mind at war with the conventions of his society, a mind drawn inexorably to ideas of fairness, dignity, and the quiet assertion of humanity in a world that sought to erase it. Zara shadowed him at a discreet distance, her eyes scanning the workers and the surrounding environment with meticulous attention. Though she remained officially invisible to the colonel's guests and to the world beyond the plantation, she was the nucleus around which the careful, revolutionary changes on Magnolia Grove revolved. She observed the field hands as they bent over the soil, noting fatigue, subtle signs of illness, and the inefficiencies imposed by poor tools or unnecessary tasks. These were not mere observations for the sake of labor management. They were lessons in human care, strategy, and leverage. The colonel stopped near the edge of the cotton field, brushing a hand over the top of a plant. "Notice, Zara," he said quietly, "how the younger ones work. They have skill but lack guidance. Strength alone is insufficient without direction." Zara nodded silently, committing his words to memory. Strength, guidance, intellect. These were the tools they would wield together, quietly, beneath the radar of neighbors who could neither understand nor tolerate such notions. Education had become the weapon of choice in Colonel Ashford's carefully curated revolution. He allowed Zara to teach a select few of the slaves to read and write, always in secrecy, always with discretion. It was a decision that would have been unthinkable elsewhere, a perilous choice that could destroy everything if discovered. But the colonel had recognized, from the very first day, that intelligence was not a threat if wielded with prudence. It was instead a means of strengthening the human spirit, of elevating the minds and loyalty of those entrusted to him. The pair made their way to the kitchen, where Sarah, the cook, moved with practiced precision. Her eyes lifted briefly when Zara entered, a silent acknowledgement of the shared complicity that had grown between them over months of subtle coordination. Sarah had begun to understand that Zara was not merely a servant, not merely a worker, but a strategist, an organizer, a force quietly reshaping the rules of the plantation. "Colonel," Sarah said softly, "they're starting to notice changes. The neighbors, I mean, they talk." The colonel's brow furrowed. "Talk, yes. But knowledge is more powerful than gossip, Zara. Let them whisper. We are doing what is right, not what is expected." He looked at Zara, and she caught the faintest flicker of pride in his gaze. He trusted her judgment implicitly, and that trust was a rare currency in a world obsessed with appearances and inheritance. To be trusted by a man like James Ashford was to hold a position of unspoken influence. That afternoon, Zara oversaw a group of younger slaves as they practiced reading simple passages from French texts. Their pronunciation was halting, their attention wavering, but the progress was undeniable. The colonel walked among them, offering encouragement and correction with a tone of authority tempered by respect. "Do not fear the word," he instructed, his voice steady. "Language is your tool, your shield, and your key." Zara's heart lifted at his words, for in that moment she saw the vision of a world she had long imagined taking shape, not one without hardship, but one where intellect and courage could bend circumstance to purpose. The progress on Magnolia Grove did not go unnoticed. White neighbors, men whose lives were steeped in the rigid hierarchies of property and ownership, began to murmur their concerns. Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Patterson, two planters from neighboring estates, visited under the guise of casual inquiry. Their eyes were cold, their questions pointed, and their opinions clear. Any hint of progress or humanity granted to slaves was a contagion, a dangerous precedent. "Ashford," Whitmore said, leaning against a carved railing, "heard you've been making some changes. Treating your slaves well, is that right?" The colonel's response was measured, almost imperceptibly defiant. "I treat them as I would any valuable asset," he said evenly. "Well-maintained property lasts longer and performs better." Patterson scoffed lightly. "Or perhaps you are spoiling them, making them think themselves more than property." "And what would that be, Patterson?" Ashford countered. "Property, nothing more, nothing less. Begin treating them like people, and they begin to think, and thinking spreads." Zara observed from the shadowed doorway, noting the tension crackling like electricity in the air. The threat was clear. Her existence, her education, and her influence were already unsettling the established social order. The colonel's words were a subtle rebellion, a line drawn in the sand that whispered of a world not yet ready for change. After the visitors departed, Ashford returned to his study, where Zara found him staring out the window, troubled. "They fear," she said softly, "the idea that slaves might be human." "Is it, Zara?" he asked, turning to meet her gaze. "Is everything we've built here founded on a lie?" She met his question without hesitation. "Yes, sir. But that doesn't mean it cannot become something better." He considered her words, and in that quiet moment, the foundations of trust and mutual purpose were solidified. They shared a vision, dangerous and revolutionary, in a world determined to uphold cruelty and ignorance. By nightfall, the plantation hummed with ordinary activity, the clatter of dishes, the distant laughter of workers, the steady rhythm of life moving forward. Yet in the library and study, in whispered conversations and the rustle of pages being turned, the seeds of a profound transformation were being sown. Education, intelligence, and courage were quietly becoming the tools that would one day challenge not just the boundaries of Magnolia Grove, but the entire world that sought to contain them. And Zara, once a dismissed girl, now an architect of subtle revolutions, understood that the real work had only just begun. The first real sign that Victoria Bowmont had noticed the quiet upheaval at Magnolia Grove arrived on a humid August evening, her arrival unannounced and deliberate. She entered the grand house with the confidence of a woman used to command, her silk skirts whispering across the polished floor, her voice honeyed with the sharp steel of intent. "James, darling," she said, placing herself at the center of the dining room as if she owned every corner, "I've been hearing the most interesting rumors about you and that slave I gave you." Colonel Ashford maintained his composure, though the subtle tension in his shoulders betrayed the knowledge that Victoria's visits were never casual. "What sort of rumors?" he asked, voice neutral, masking both irritation and wariness. Victoria's smile was deliberate, slow, and calculated. "Oh, just silly talk about how indispensable she has become, how much time you spend with her. People are saying she has influence over you." Her eyes flicked toward the kitchen doorway, where Zara, ever invisible to guests, could observe her with full clarity. Every syllable Victoria uttered was a probe, a test of loyalty and weakness, a strategic move to unsettle the colonel and to intimidate Zara simultaneously. "Zara has been very helpful with organizing my library," the colonel replied, careful to frame his words around competence, not sentiment. She has a natural aptitude for such work. Victoria laughed, a brittle, sharp sound that seemed to cut through the air like glass. Natural aptitude, she repeated, leaning slightly forward, her tone dripping with derision. How charming, and exactly what does this aptitude involve? She can read, Ashford said firmly, the weight of his words surprising in their calmness. Your uncle taught her before he died. She assists with correspondence and research. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face went pale as fury pooled behind her eyes. Read? For you mean she recognizes a few simple words? No, the colonel said, his voice unwavering. She reads Latin, French, and English fluently. She is invaluable to me. Victoria's wineglass shattered in her hand, the red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Her fury was no longer hidden. Impossible, she hissed. A field slave barely above an animal. Your uncle would never. Your uncle was a remarkable man, Ashford interrupted, his voice steady and deliberate. And Zara is a remarkable woman. I have never met anyone, black or white, with such intellect. The word woman hung heavily in the air between them. Not slave, not property, but woman. The tension cracked further as Victoria's composure finally faltered entirely. James, you're being ridiculous. She's a slave, a piece of property. You can't possibly— I can and I do, Ashford said, standing now, his expression a mask of controlled certainty. Zara has become indispensable, and I will not allow her to be insulted in my home. Victoria's scream echoed, raw and uncontained. She swept toward the door, her movement dramatic and deliberate, then paused for a final blow. You'll regret this, James Ashford. Both of you will regret this. I'll make sure of it. After her departure, the colonel found Zara in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the broken glass with trembling hands. Zara, he said softly, I'm sorry you had to hear that. It's nothing I haven't endured before, sir, she replied, steadiness returning to her voice. No, he said, taking a step closer. It's not nothing. You shouldn't have to endure such cruelty. His eyes met hers, unwavering. Zara, I meant every word in there. You are remarkable, and I've come to care for you deeply. A strange mixture of fear and resolve settled over her. Sir, I know it's impossible. The world will never accept it. It is not impossible, Zara, he said quietly. It is dangerous, but some truths are worth the risk. That night, as she lay in her small room adjacent to the library, Zara contemplated the magnitude of Victoria's threats and the colonel's declarations. Victoria believed she was contending with a mere servant, someone easily intimidated or broken, but she underestimated what Zara had cultivated over years: intelligence, strategy, and patience. This was not a naive girl at her mercy. Victoria had created a nemesis, a calculated adversary who could turn weakness into strength and cruelty into opportunity. Within a week, the attacks began in society. Rumors swirled through Charleston, whispered between women at tea and men at the club, always following a predictable pattern. The colonel had been bewitched by his slave, voodoo or charm had been used, and a scandal of unimaginable proportions was brewing. Sarah, during a visit to the neighboring Whitmore plantation, conveyed the details to Zara. They're singing terrible things, she whispered. Miss Victoria has been telling the ladies you've got some hold over the colonel. Zara listened, heart steady. In the Antebellum South, such accusations could mean death for a black woman, while the white man faced social peril. The mere rumor of a romantic relationship between a white planter and a black woman was incendiary, capable of unraveling lives with terrifying speed. And yet, Colonel Ashford's response remained measured. He neither denied nor shied away. My business is my own, he told the whispers that reached his ears. Let them think what they please. The campaign intensified. Invitations ceased. Business associates distanced themselves. Banks scrutinized the plantation's accounts with new suspicion. Victoria orchestrated isolation and pressure, seeking to coerce the colonel into compliance by threatening his social, financial, and personal stability. But Zara saw the flaw in Victoria's plan. The colonel's conviction and the subtle, invisible power of her own intelligence formed a bulwark that the malicious campaign could not penetrate entirely. Each whispered insult, each careful rumor, and each orchestrated threat became fodder for their quiet counter-strategy. While the world assumed vulnerability, Zara prepared. She coordinated with the network of house slaves, mapping influence and collecting intelligence. Victoria was setting the stage for a decisive move, but Zara, aware and patient, was already planning the response that would transform the fight from defensive to absolute. Victoria's war had begun, subtle, insidious, but Zara understood fully. A woman armed with intellect, strategy, and unwavering resolve was not merely a target, she was the storm that would return in force. In the weeks that followed, Victoria Bowmont's audacious confrontation, the atmosphere at Magnolia Grove shifted subtly but unmistakably. Rumors moved faster than smoke through the city of Charleston, whispering from salon to parlor, from market to courthouse. The colony of gossip that Victoria had carefully nurtured began to take tangible form, spreading fear among those who feared anything outside the strict confines of custom and color. Each morning, as Zara polished the silver and arranged the library's tomes, she could sense the tension curling through the corridors like a living thing. Even the staff, usually composed and efficient, exchanged quick glances that betrayed awareness of the invisible storm gathering around their household. Sarah, ever loyal and perceptive, brought news daily. "Miss Zara," she whispered, leaning close as they arranged dinnerware, "folks are talking. Not just Charleston, but neighboring plantations too. People say Colonel Ashford's lost his senses, that you've changed him." Zara's lips pressed into a line. She understood fully the weapon that Victoria wielded. Rumor. Whispers could destroy reputations faster than any legal action, and Victoria had mastered the craft, her beauty masking her cunning. Yet Zara did not flinch. She had spent years observing human behavior, learning the power of perception, and she knew how to turn attention into leverage. By the end of the second week, the whispers became audacious enough to manifest as direct threats. Business associates began canceling scheduled visits. Plantations she had long relied upon now seemed hesitant to provide the services Magnolia Grove required. Invitations to social events disappeared, replaced with cold formality or thinly veiled caution. Even the local bank began sending letters questioning the legitimacy of Ashford's accounts, probing as though ready to call in loans or question property titles. Zara noted the patterns, her mind like a chessboard, every piece in motion. Victoria was attempting to isolate the colonel, to make him vulnerable, to force a choice between preserving his reputation and maintaining his association with Zara. But every move Victoria made was catalogued and analyzed. Zara had no intention of giving Victoria the satisfaction of a misstep unnoticed. One evening, while the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the sprawling Magnolia Grove grounds, Zara approached the colonel with what had been weighing heavily on her mind. "Sir," she began cautiously, "I've been hearing things. About us. About what people are saying. The rumors." He looked up from his papers, the weight of letters and business documents etched onto his features. "I've heard them too, Zara," he admitted. "I'm sorry you have to endure such talk." "It's not about what I endure, sir," she replied. "It's about what this could cost you. Your reputation, your business, your future." Ashford's eyes held hers, unwavering. "My future," he repeated. "Zara, what future would I have without you? Before you came, I was alone, half a man, ashamed of my limitations. You've given me more than I ever imagined." His hand brushed across a scattered stack of letters, as if the documents themselves reminded him of the chaos Victoria sought to impose. Zara felt the gravity of the unspoken truth. To survive, they would need strategy, allies, and courage. She had already begun to reach out through the network of house slaves, a web of intelligence that Victoria could not penetrate, gathering information quietly, piece by piece. Every whispered insult, every curious glance, every social slight was being catalogued, each becoming a thread in a net designed to catch the overreaching plans of Victoria Bowmont. Before a solution could be solidified, events accelerated. The sound of horses' hooves against gravel one late evening signaled an unexpected intrusion. The colonel frowned. No visitors had been expected, and the timing was unusual. Moments later, the arrival of Victoria, Sheriff Morrison, and two prominent neighboring planters confirmed the worst. The confrontation had escalated from rumor to a formal challenge. Victoria, always composed, now masked her cruelty with feigned concern. "James," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "we've come as friends to discuss a serious matter." "And what matter would that be?" the colonel asked, maintaining his careful neutrality, every muscle taut beneath the tailored jacket. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the gun at his hip, a symbol of authority and threat combined. "Colonel Ashford," he said, voice thick with the power of law, "there have been complaints about your relationship with this slave. Complaints suggesting violation of natural law and state statutes." The colonel's calm did not falter. "I am not aware of any laws I have broken, Sheriff." Whitmore, one of the accompanying planters, leaned forward. "The law against cohabitation between the races, for one," he said. "The law against corrupting the natural order God established. You live alone with her. The influence over your household is undeniable." Ashford's response was firm, eyes narrowing. "I live alone in this house. Zara has her own quarters. As for the natural order, I believe God gave all people minds capable of learning and hearts capable of love." Victoria's eyes flared with triumph, sensing a public victory. "There," she said, her voice sweet and scathing simultaneously, "he admits unnatural feelings for that creature." "No," Ashford replied coldly. "I respect her mind and value her companionship. If that is unnatural, then I am proud to be unnatural." The two planters bristled. "Ashford, this is dangerous. Your slaves are getting ideas above their station. This sets a precedent we cannot allow." "What my slaves think is my business, not yours," the colonel said. His tone left no room for negotiation, no subtlety for intimidation. The confrontation was clear. Social power and legal threat had arrived, but Ashford and Zara were prepared. Zara's heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. Victoria had made her first mistake. She had underestimated the intellect, patience, and strategy of the woman she intended to crush. Every whisper, every social slight, every legal threat became fuel, and Zara was ready to transform these attacks into a weapon. The battlefield had shifted from rumor to law, from whispers to confrontation, and in every moment, Zara and the colonel stood united. The crisp autumn air of Magnolia Grove carried a deceptive calm that night, a stillness masking the storm that Victoria Bowmont had orchestrated. Zara awoke before dawn, roused not by dreams, but by the unmistakable, acrid scent of smoke. Her chest tightened as she realized immediately what it meant: fire. Leaping from her cot, she ran toward the window, eyes widening at the horror before her. Flames licked the wooden roofs of the slave quarters, twisting smoke into the pre-dawn sky. Shouts and screams echoed across the plantation grounds, the chaos growing as enslaved families scrambled from their homes. 15 souls, each a story of survival, a thread in the delicate tapestry of Magnolia Grove, were now at the mercy of fire and fear. "Fire! Everyone out!" Zara screamed, her voice carrying across the smoke-choked air. Nightgown clinging, hair disheveled, she raced into the fray, her feet pounding against the dirt, heart hammering not just from fear, but from outrage. The colonel appeared, steady as ever, despite the flames. Together, they organized a bucket brigade, moving water from the nearby well to douse the blaze. Yet Zara's trained eye quickly recognized the pattern. 3 separate points of ignition, the unmistakable chemical tang of coal oil, a calculated act, a signal of malice, not accident. By dawn, the fire had reduced the quarters to smoldering ruins. Miraculously, no one had perished, though burns and smoke, inhalation left their mark on several. Zara moved from figure to figure, helping the wounded, offering a quiet word of comfort while suppressing the rising tide of fury in her own chest. This was Victoria's design. Chaos and blame, meant to isolate her, to paint her as the source of rebellion. Sheriff Morrison arrived shortly after, flanked by deputies whose boots crunched on ash and debris. "Terrible tragedy, Colonel," he said, voice thick with false sympathy. "We'll need to investigate to ensure this wasn't some sort of uprising." "Uprising?" Ashford demanded, anger rising as he shielded Zara with a glance. "These are victims, not criminals." The sheriff's gaze landed on Zara. "We'll need her for special questioning," he said, a subtle command. "She must come with us." Zara felt the trap snapping shut. Victoria's plan was meticulous. Blame the educated, influential slave for inciting rebellion, force the colonel to make an impossible choice, and discredit him socially and economically. Every detail had been accounted for, every witness carefully placed. On what charges? The colonel demanded, his voice cutting through the thick tension. Inciting rebellion, destruction of property, conspiracy, Morrison replied, reciting a prepared litany. Witnesses say she's been filling other slaves' heads with dangerous ideas. Zara held the colonel's gaze, steady. Remember what we read about Socrates, she said quietly. Sometimes the truth is worth dying for. He understood immediately. She would face the ordeal with courage, intellect, and dignity. Socrates had chosen death rather than compromise his principles, and Zara would not submit to a lie, even for survival. The Charleston jail awaited her, a stone and iron tomb designed to crush spirit before body. Her cell was barely large enough to lie down, a bucket for sanitation, no window, no reprieve. Every sound, the creak of doors, the distant clatter of chains, was magnified in the oppressive darkness. Victoria's assumption was clear. Isolation would break her, render her powerless, make her easier to control. Yet Zara found clarity in the prison's suffocating silence. Time to think, to plan, to strategize, a luxury Victoria had never afforded herself. She had underestimated the patient, methodical mind that had been honed over years of survival, observation, and education. On the third day, a guard brought an unexpected visitor. Robert Smalls, a free man and legal clerk from Charleston, appeared at the cell, his eyes sharp with purpose. "Colonel Ashford sent me," he said quietly. "He wants you to know he's fighting for you, but he needs your help." "What kind of help?" Zara asked, suspicion and hope mingling in her chest. "Evidence. Proof of Victoria Bowmont's orchestration of the fire and your wrongful arrest. Without it, the trial will be exactly what she wants, a legal lynching." Zara smiled grimly, revealing the careful work she had already done. "Tell the colonel to check the library. Behind the complete works of Voltaire, there's a loose brick. Inside, letters." Robert's eyes widened. "Letters?" "Yes. Victoria's correspondence with her opium supplier, letters detailing her debts, her manipulation of the legal system, and instructions to her cousin, the judge, to ensure a favorable outcome. I've been gathering them through the network of house slaves for months. The fire, the arrest, the carefully orchestrated legal threats, all of it had been anticipated. Every step Victoria took had been watched, recorded, and counted in invisible ways. Victoria believed she faced a powerless, ignorant slave. In reality, she faced a strategist, a scholar, a woman who understood the full weight of intellect as a weapon. "There's more," Zara continued. "Financial records of Rosewood Plantation, evidence of bankruptcy, debts, sales of slaves and land. Victoria's plan to marry the colonel to escape ruin is clear." Robert shook his head in amazement. "You've been preparing for months." "Years," Zara corrected. "Victoria thinks she fights ignorance, but she fights a mind trained in philosophy, strategy, and patience. She never stood a chance. And at that moment, despite the darkness of her cell and the smoke of burned homes, Zara knew one truth above all. Victoria Bowmont had triggered a war, but she had awakened a power that could not be contained, a force born of intelligence, courage, and an unyielding determination to survive. The battle had arrived, and Zara would fight it with every weapon she possessed. The prison walls closed around Zara like a second skin, unyielding and cold, but they could not contain her mind. Every tick of the clock, every scrape of iron, every muffled step in the corridor was fuel for strategy. She spent her hours reflecting, cataloging information, and refining the network she had painstakingly cultivated among house slaves and sympathetic free people. She understood that her survival depended not only on courage, but on precision, timing, and influence. Zara had already begun reaching out through coded messages, slipping notes to trusted contacts who moved unnoticed between plantations. Each letter was carefully folded, often hidden in linens or the lining of a broom, and contained subtle instructions: listen, observe, report. The network was vast, extending from Charleston to the rural outskirts, and each individual was a node of intelligence, Knowledge was power, and Zara wielded it like a blade. The colonel, though absent, remained her anchor. Through Robert Smalls, Zara received updates, inquiries about witnesses, confirmations that legal counsel had been secured, and subtle hints of support from allies who understood both her intellect and the colonel's integrity. Each message was a thread in the growing tapestry of defense, evidence meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced against the likely accusations. She knew Victoria would not act alone. Every attack had been calculated: the fire, the false witnesses, the legal threats. Each step was designed to isolate her and force the colonel to submit, to fracture the bond that had already begun to form between them. Yet Zara also knew Victoria's arrogance was her greatest weakness. She underestimated the discipline, foresight, and sheer audacity of her opponent. Within the prison, Zara conducted what could only be described as an internal council. She memorized every letter, every scrap of information, every potential ally. She mapped the local plantations in her mind, noting which slaves were loyal, which could be persuaded, and which would be silent observers. Knowledge of human behavior became her battlefield, information her arsenal. Robert returned the following evening with an additional piece of vital intelligence. The colonel had secured William Porche Miles, a lawyer with a reputation for defending truth in cases where societal norms and prejudice threatened justice. Miles, Zara learned, was meticulous, relentless, and entirely undeterred by social pressure, a perfect match for the delicate intricacies of her case. "The trial," Robert said, lowering his voice, "will be a spectacle. The courtroom will be filled with spectators eager to see a slave humiliated. But the colonel believes in you, and so do I. With evidence and strategy, we can turn their spectacle into their defeat." Zara nodded. She understood the stakes. This was not merely a trial of law, it was a trial of perception, an assault on centuries of prejudice, a test of whether intelligence could triumph over fear and societal expectation. She spent the night constructing a defense plan in her mind, rehearsing arguments, anticipating attacks. Every letter she had acquired from Victoria's careless correspondence became ammunition. Every record of debts and opium dealings a cornerstone of undeniable proof. If Victoria sought to manipulate the law, Zara would manipulate her ignorance and overconfidence against her. Meanwhile, the colonel took his own steps to prepare. He ensured that Magnolia Grove remained functional, tending to both the plantation and the morale of its remaining slaves. He liaised with the legal team, confirming details, ensuring that every potential loophole Victoria might exploit was sealed. Yet, he also recognized that the true power lay not in money or influence, but in the intellect and determination of the woman who had been sent to him as a cruel joke. Zara's allies, too, began to take shape beyond the walls of the prison. House slaves from neighboring estates, who had once been invisible observers, now became couriers, messengers, and guardians of critical information. Each person moved quietly, carrying details of Victoria's corruption, her opium dependence, her financial desperation, and her orchestration of the fire. Every small act of courage and discretion added another layer to the fortress of defense surrounding Zara. In the quiet moments before dawn, Zara allowed herself a brief reflection. She remembered the first time she had read Latin and French under Uncle Edmund's tutelage, the thrill of understanding, the sense of possibility it had ignited. Knowledge had been her greatest weapon, and now it was the weapon that would determine the course of her life. Victoria had underestimated that. She had assumed that education and intellect could not exist in a slave, that intelligence would be contained by circumstance and color. But Zara had turned those assumptions into tools of liberation. By the fifth day, the stage was set. Evidence was catalogued, witnesses were prepared, the legal team was briefed, and allies were in place. Even within the grim confines of her cell, Zara felt a quiet surge of confidence. Every calculated move, every secret message, every careful observation had brought her closer to the moment when Victoria's facade would crumble and the truth would emerge. As she lay down that night, listening to the muffled footsteps of the guards, Zara allowed herself one final thought. Intelligence, courage, and meticulous preparation could topple even the most entrenched systems of power. Victoria had thought to crush her spirit, but instead, she had created an opponent she could never anticipate. The battle was not yet over, but the tide had shifted, and Zara, armed with knowledge and unwavering resolve, was ready for the confrontation that would decide everything. The courthouse steps were crowded with the curious, the judgmental, and the outright hostile. Charleston society had turned out in force, eager to witness the humiliation of a slave who had dared to rise above her station. The wooden doors groaned under the weight of expectation as Zara was escorted inside, shackled but unbroken, her head held high. Every eye in the room was on her, yet she moved as though invisible to them, unseen yet entirely present in her awareness of every whisper, every sneer, every subtle gesture of scorn. Victoria Bowmont had arranged her front row with meticulous care, black silk, calculated posture, and an expression of wounded civility, all designed to evoke sympathy and righteous indignation. She played her role flawlessly, the practiced mask of the elite Southern woman hiding the venom beneath. Yet, Zara noted the tiny tells, the tightening of fingers, the imperceptible twitch of a lip that hinted at the storm brewing under that poised exterior. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Zara as a manipulative, dangerous influence, a corrupting force among the enslaved population. Witnesses spoke of her being near the slave quarters before the fire, of her unnatural influence over the minds of those who should have remained obedient. The words rebellion and corruption were repeated like incantations, a spell meant to cement fear and justify punishment. The air in the courtroom grew thick with prejudice, anticipation, and the weight of centuries-old assumptions about race and property. But Zara had prepared. Every fact, every observation, every scrap of evidence she had secured was already catalogued in her mind. She was no longer merely a slave on trial. She was the architect of a defense that could turn the courtroom against the very forces that sought to destroy her. Through her allies, every letter Victoria had carelessly written detailing debts, opium indulgence, schemes to manipulate legal authorities was already in the hands of William Porche Miles, the lawyer whose reputation for defending truth was unparalleled. Miles began methodically, his voice steady and commanding, presenting letters one by one. The courtroom hushed as evidence of Victoria's manipulations came to light. Letters revealing her financial desperation, her dependency on opium, her orchestration of false witnesses, and her attempts to corrupt the legal system itself were read aloud. Each document exposed the fragility of Victoria's carefully constructed facade. Gasps rippled through the spectators as the letters unfolded the story of greed, obsession, and cruelty hidden beneath beauty and civility. Zara watched, fully present yet disciplined, as Victoria's mask began to crack. The slightest hesitation, the almost imperceptible flush of rage, betrayed her composure. Miles pressed on, presenting financial ledgers, estate records, and careful analyses of her mismanaged plantations. Evidence accumulated like a crescendo, building a mountain of truth that made Victoria's accusations collapse under their own weight. The most damning moment came when a letter to Judge Whitmore, Victoria's cousin, was read aloud. In it, she explicitly asked for legal intervention to remove Zara under the guise of preserving the natural order. The judge, forced to acknowledge his involvement, recused himself, and a new judge was appointed, one with no familial ties and a reputation for fairness. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The imbalance of power had shifted subtly but irrevocably. Victoria, desperate, finally took the stand. Her composure was gone, replaced by the simmering fury that had defined her every interaction with Zara. Under cross-examination, her opium use, financial ruin, and manipulations were laid bare. Each admission peeled away layers of her deception, leaving the raw, bitter core exposed. She screamed about Zara's audacity, her unnatural intellect, and her undeserved influence over the colonel, but every word she uttered only confirmed her guilt. Zara, shackled yet untouchable in spirit, felt an unfamiliar but exhilarating sense of vindication. The courtroom's eyes were no longer solely on her. They had shifted, focusing on the unraveling of the woman who had tried to destroy her. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was the measured force of justice, the embodiment of intellect overcoming cruelty. Miles concluded his arguments with precision, addressing both the jury and the lingering whispers of Charleston society. He framed the case not as a threat posed by a slave, but as the exposure of a woman who had attempted fraud, arson, and the subversion of the law to serve her selfish desires. The distinction was subtle but seismic. The villainy was no longer Zara's supposed rebellion, but Victoria's actions, laid bare for all to see. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Spectators shifted uneasily, whispers giving way to nervous silence. The veneer of Southern civility could not mask the recognition that their assumptions were being challenged. A slave, educated and courageous, had taken control of the narrative. The room seemed suspended, waiting for the inevitable acknowledgement of truth. When the verdict was finally announced, relief and triumph surged through Zara, tempered by the dim knowledge that freedom in Charleston was precarious. Every legal victory required vigilance, every triumph invited scrutiny. Yet at that moment, she stood not as property, but as a human being whose intellect, strategy, and courage had conquered prejudice. The first blow to Victoria's carefully maintained world had landed, and Zara could feel the ripple of power shift subtly, irrevocably. Intelligence, preparation, and resolve had carved a path through fear and injustice, setting the stage for the next chapter of both retribution and liberation. Victoria Bowmont was not a woman accustomed to defeat. Her beauty had been her weapon, her wealth her shield, and her social position her armor. Yet now, standing amidst the ruins of her plans, she faced the one opponent she could neither buy, charm, nor intimidate: Zara. The courtroom had exposed her lies, her debts, her vices, and her cruelty, leaving her reputation in tatters. But Victoria was nothing if not relentless, and defeat only ignited the fire of her vengeance. Within hours of the trial's conclusion, she retreated to her Charleston mansion, calling her closest confidantes and allies. Her voice was taut with fury as she orchestrated her next move. "They think this is over," she hissed, pacing the length of her opulent parlor. "They think they've won, but they've only awakened the storm. Ashford and that creature will pay for their audacity. We will dismantle them piece by piece." Her plan was cunning, insidious, and perfectly tailored to the weaknesses she believed existed in Zara and the Colonel's defenses. Victoria knew the power of social ostracization and legal harassment, but she also understood that brute force alone would not suffice. She needed leverage, a way to manipulate those around them, to sow distrust, fear, and chaos. She would strike at the system that both protected and constrained them. Victoria's first act was to exploit the fragility of the Charleston social network. She began spreading whispers that the Colonel had violated laws beyond the court's scrutiny, hinting at moral corruption and financial mismanagement. Letters were sent to influential merchants, planters, and politicians, each containing carefully curated information designed to paint the Colonel as reckless, weak, and morally compromised. Each missive was subtle, insinuating impropriety rather than making explicit accusations, so that when people spoke of it, the tone was always cautious, fearful, and filled with doubt. Meanwhile, she leveraged her connections with law enforcement and the judiciary. Sheriff Morrison remained a willing accomplice, his loyalty bound to Victoria's influence and promises of social prestige. Under her direction, minor investigations began into the Colonel's property, the accounts of Magnolia Grove, and the employment of enslaved people. Nothing illegal could be proven, but the insinuations alone were enough to make creditors nervous, to unsettle employees, and to send waves of apprehension through the Charleston elite. Zara, ever vigilant, saw the subtle currents of Victoria's counterattack before they became fully realized. She noted the tension in the letters from the neighboring plantations, the nervous energy among the house slaves who brought her updates, and the Colonel's rare moments of worry. She understood that Victoria's strategy relied not on brute force, but on undermining their allies, turning friends into doubters, and making even the strongest defenses appear vulnerable. "You've been quiet," the Colonel remarked one evening as he returned from a meeting with a hesitant banker. "What are you thinking, Zara?" "I'm thinking, sir, that Victoria's victory lies in control, not confrontation. She will not strike openly again. She will poison from the shadows. Her goal is to make every step we take uncertain, to make us question ourselves and our allies." The Colonel ran a hand through his hair, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "She will not succeed. I will not let her." Zara's gaze was steady. She can't defeat us with open force. But if we hesitate, if we falter in our resolve, she can cause damage that might take years to undo. We must anticipate every move, prepare every response, and act with precision. Intelligence and strategy, sir, will be our weapons. Victoria's next gambit came swiftly. Utilizing her knowledge of the local press, she ensured that stories appeared in the Charleston Gazette, subtly suggesting that the colonel's plantation was mismanaged and that the loyalty of his enslaved people was questionable. Headlines hinted at unrest, without any evidence to support it. The community began to murmur, doubt creeping into the minds of those who had once admired Magnolia Grove's success. At Magnolia Grove, tension grew palpable. The house slaves whispered nervously about potential repercussions. The field workers were uneasy, and even the colonel felt the first cracks of anxiety. Zara moved through the plantation like a general surveying her troops, reassuring, instructing, and preparing. Every contingency was planned, every rumor countered with fact, every act of sabotage anticipated. Zara's preparation paid off when Victoria attempted to exploit one of the colonel's creditors. She arranged for a shipment of goods to be delayed, hoping to provoke financial panic. But Zara had already accounted for this, and through careful coordination with the plantation managers, the delay was mitigated, and no harm came to the estate's operations. Victoria's plan had failed before it began. Furious at her inability to destabilize the colonel through indirect means, Victoria resorted to personal attacks, sending anonymous threats to Zara, attempting to frighten her into submission. Letters filled with venomous language and implied threats were intercepted, and Zara read each with a cold, measured resolve. They were weapons of fear, but she understood that fear could be transformed into clarity. Each missive became intelligence, a window into Victoria's psyche, revealing not strength, but desperation. One evening, as the last candle flickered in the library, Zara spoke to the colonel with a calm authority that only came from complete mastery of the situation. Victoria's greatest weapon is panic. She hopes we will falter because we fear her, but fear can be studied, anticipated, and neutralized. She is predictable because desperation makes people predictable. Every move she makes is a reaction to her defeat, not a creation of opportunity. We are not reacting, we are controlling the battlefield. The colonel looked at her, a mixture of admiration and awe shining in his eyes. You see so much, Zara. I am grateful to have your mind guiding every step. And I am grateful to have yours, she replied, a subtle smile touching her lips. Together, we will survive her schemes, sir, and when the time comes, we will turn her own strategies against her. Victoria believes she controls the game, but we have learned to read her play before she makes it. That is the power of knowledge and preparation. Victoria Bowmont's counterattack had begun, but Zara was ready. Every rumor, every letter, every whispered threat became an opportunity to anticipate, plan, and strike preemptively. She understood that Victoria's desperation was her greatest vulnerability, and she would exploit it methodically, ensuring that every attempt at revenge only served to hasten Victoria's ultimate downfall. The war was no longer theoretical. It was active, and Zara was poised to dominate it with intelligence, patience, and unyielding resolve. The weeks following Victoria's failed counterattacks were filled with a tense, almost palpable unease at Magnolia Grove. The estate seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next move in a game whose rules were invisible to everyone, except Zara and the colonel. While Victoria's attempts to disrupt the plantation had largely failed, her persistence signaled a dangerous escalation. She would not simply relent. She would double her efforts, and Zara knew it. It began with subtle interference in the daily life of the estate. Deliveries were delayed, messages intercepted, and workers approached by strangers asking questions about their loyalty to the colonel. Rumors circulated among the surrounding plantations that Magnolia Grove harbored rebellious elements. Each whisper was like a stone tossed into calm water, creating ripples of suspicion and unease. Zara methodically collected every piece of information, recording details in a ledger she kept hidden behind the library's false wall. Every stranger's visit, every question asked, every nervous glance from the house slaves was catalogued with precision. The colonel, proud yet increasingly concerned, observed the tension around his home. He had always valued Zara's intellect, but the sheer scale of Victoria's relentless scheming forced him to appreciate her foresight in ways he had not before. One evening, as they stood on the veranda overlooking the plantation, he said quietly, "Zara, I had no idea a single person could carry so much malice and cunning. I fear what she might attempt next." Zara's eyes, reflecting the moonlight, were calm and resolute. "Fear is only useful if it teaches us something. Victoria's anger is predictable. She is desperate, and desperation leads to recklessness. Her next move will be bold, but it will leave traces, subtle ones, that we can anticipate. She cannot act without revealing her intentions." The first major escalation came unexpectedly. One morning, as the household gathered for breakfast, a messenger arrived with a sealed envelope stamped with the insignia of Charleston's courts. The handwriting was formal, precise, and unmistakably influenced by Victoria's circle. The letter contained an official summons for the colonel to appear at a hearing regarding alleged mismanagement of Magnolia Grove and claims of harboring insubordinate slaves. The wording was deliberately vague, creating suspicion without evidence, a trap designed to force anxiety and inaction. Zara read the summons quietly, her hands steady, her mind calculating. "They are attempting to intimidate you, sir, but there is no substance here. It is pure theater." The colonel frowned. "The theater is convincing, Zara. The neighbors are already whispering about compliance, or lack thereof. I fear this could escalate beyond rumor into tangible action." "Then we prepare," she replied, her tone precise and commanding. "We anticipate each move before it is made. We secure every vulnerable point, and we control the narrative. Victoria cannot act in a vacuum. She will leave traces, and those traces will reveal her intentions. We only need to be vigilant enough to follow them." The hearing was scheduled for 2 days later in Charleston. Zara insisted on accompanying the colonel, despite the risks. She understood that presence was power. By being visible and composed, she could counter the narrative of a timid, manipulated slave, showing instead a woman capable of reason, influence, and resilience. Arriving in Charleston, the tension became almost tangible. Crowds had gathered outside the courthouse, curious spectators eager to witness the perceived scandal. Whispers filled the streets, fueled by Victoria's calculated insinuations. Each step toward the courthouse was a reminder that society's gaze was relentless, judgmental, and ready to punish any perceived transgression. Yet Zara held her head high, her poise unwavering, her intellect a shield against the waves of social prejudice. Inside the courthouse, Victoria's allies awaited, their expressions masks of outrage, carefully constructed to sway the proceedings. Sheriff Morrison stood at her side, his posture stiff, his hand hovering near his weapon. The judge, impartial yet wary, called the session to order. Victoria began her argument with controlled fury, painting a picture of the colonel as a man incapable of managing his estate and the enslaved people under his care. She insinuated rebellion, mismanagement, and moral corruption, presenting selective evidence to bolster her claims. Each word was crafted to provoke doubt and fear, yet each statement was meticulously countered by the colonel and Zara's careful preparation. Zara, aware of every nuance, observed the reactions of the jury, the judge, and the gallery. She noted the subtle signs of doubt, the slight hesitation in Victoria's supporters, and the tension among those who had once been indifferent. She whispered strategic observations to the colonel, ensuring his responses remained precise, firm, and unassailable. Her efforts culminated in a masterful display during cross-examination. Victoria's own letters, carefully hidden and collected by Zara, were presented as evidence of manipulation and falsehood. The courtroom murmured in shock, as each letter revealed the extent of Victoria's desperation and deceit. Financial records showed deliberate mismanagement on Victoria's part, attempts to shift blame, and a systematic campaign to undermine Magnolia Grove's reputation. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that Victoria's efforts had not only failed, but backfired spectacularly. The court recognized the baselessness of her claims, dismissing the charges against the colonel entirely. Victoria's credibility was irreparably damaged, her attempts to control the narrative laid bare as manipulative and deceitful. As they left the courthouse, Zara turned to the colonel, her calm authority unshaken. "Victoria will not relent, sir. She will continue her schemes, But each act now exposes her further. Every attempt she makes to undermine us strengthens our position. Knowledge, preparation, and composure are our greatest defenses. The colonel's gaze softened, a mix of admiration and gratitude in his eyes. Zara, you have turned what could have been a disaster into a triumph. I owe you more than I can say. She smiled faintly, her mind already anticipating the next moves, the next threats, the next challenges. We only owe each other, sir. And together, we will ensure that every attempt at control by Victoria Bowmont ends in her own undoing. The net has tightened, and soon she will be trapped by the very schemes she devised. Outside, the streets of Charleston buzzed with the aftermath of the trial. Whispers of the colonel's victory spread, rumors of Victoria's recklessness replaced by growing recognition of Zara's intelligence and influence. The battle was far from over, but the tide had shifted decisively. The colonel and Zara had not only survived Victoria's desperate onslaught, they had turned it into an opportunity to expose her, control the narrative, and strengthen their position. Zara knew the war would continue, that Victoria's cunning would not fade overnight. But with every move meticulously countered, every trap anticipated, and every act of malice exposed, the power shifted inexorably toward those who wielded knowledge, strategy, and unyielding determination. The net had tightened, and the path to ultimate victory was now clear. The morning after the Charleston hearing, the air at Magnolia Grove felt charged with a quiet triumph. Yet Zara knew better than to mistake calm for security. Victory in court had been decisive, but it was only one battle in the larger war with Victoria Bowmont. The woman's ambition, desperation, and arrogance were now laid bare, and Zara understood that exposed enemies were often the most dangerous. Victoria's first misstep was immediate. The news of her failed attempt to manipulate the court spread quickly through Charleston society, igniting whispers that the once revered socialite was not the paragon of grace she claimed to be. Every conversation about her debts, opium addiction, and scheming revealed cracks in her carefully constructed facade. Zara's network of house slaves and neighboring contacts carried the information back to Magnolia Grove. Each update was catalogued with meticulous care. She read them aloud to the colonel one evening as they stood over the plantation map, planning defenses not against physical attack, but against the more insidious assaults of reputation and influence. "They are panicked," Zara said, her voice calm but firm. She underestimated the reach of intelligence and preparation. Every step she takes now to recover her social standing is visible. Every attempt to manipulate others will leave traces. The colonel, leaning against the mantel, nodded thoughtfully. "I had assumed she would relent after Charleston. Her desperation is formidable. I can only imagine the lengths she will go to next. She will attempt to control what she cannot possess," Zara replied. "Control is her addiction, as opium is, and every effort she makes will tighten the noose she has placed around herself." Within days, evidence of Victoria's unraveling began to appear. Letters intercepted by Zara's network revealed frantic communications to creditors, detailing her mounting debts and pleading for extensions. Other letters, hidden within the pages of her own opulent books, hinted at schemes to sell off more property to maintain her opium habit. Each discovery reinforced what Zara already knew. Victoria had built her life on deception, and now the foundation was crumbling. But Victoria was not passive in her despair. Her next move was audacious and reckless. She organized a clandestine meeting with several influential planters, attempting to paint the colonel as a man whose foolish attachment to a slave threatened the moral and economic stability of the entire region. She brought forth false witnesses, stories of imagined insubordination among Magnolia Grove's slaves, and exaggerated accounts of supposed discontent. The goal was clear: to isolate the colonel socially and financially, forcing him into compliance or ruin. Zara anticipated every aspect of the meeting. Using information gathered over months, she prepared counter-narratives, corroborated by facts, financial records, and testimonies from trusted allies. When the day of confrontation arrived, the colonel was calm, poised, and armed with more than just courage. He had the truth, and Zara ensured it was presented with precision. Victoria's theatrics began as expected. She spoke with venomous elegance, her every gesture calculated to provoke shock and sympathy simultaneously. Yet as Zara watched from the background, She noted the subtle flaws in Victoria's performance, a faltering hand when mentioning the Colonel, a hesitation before accusing Magnolia Grove's slaves, a flicker of panic when a neighbor questioned her narrative. When the Colonel responded, it was with measured authority. He countered every accusation with verifiable evidence: the stable finances of Magnolia Grove, the loyalty and contentment of his workers, and, most devastatingly, the falsification of Victoria's claims. He introduced letters collected by Zara, detailing Victoria's manipulation of her cousin, the judge, and her desperate attempts to secure loans to cover her mounting debts. Each revelation was a blow, exposing not only Victoria's greed, but her moral corruption. The gathering, intended to intimidate the Colonel, turned into a public unveiling of Victoria's own misdeeds. Whispers of dismay and outrage spread among the assembled planters. Victoria's carefully constructed mask began to crack under the weight of undeniable evidence. Zara noticed the rapid deterioration of her composure, the controlled anger replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. That evening, back at Magnolia Grove, the Colonel and Zara convened in the library. The room, filled with the familiar scent of old books and polished wood, had become their strategic command center. Zara spread letters, financial records, and notes across the table, reviewing each piece of evidence that had been used to dismantle Victoria's influence. "She cannot recover from this," Zara said, her tone precise and measured. "Every attempt she makes to regain control will only expose her further. Her creditors will demand payment, her social standing is ruined, and her schemes are now transparent. The collapse is inevitable." The Colonel placed a hand on hers, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged through shared trials. "Zara, your intellect has turned what could have been a disaster into absolute advantage. I owe you more than I can express." She smiled faintly, understanding the weight of her own transformation. Once, she had been dismissed as a slave, with no influence, no voice, and no hope. Now, she was the architect of a strategic dismantling of Victoria Bowmont's world, a testament to the power of intellect, patience, and unwavering resolve. Victoria's final gambit came in private letters sent to creditors, bankers, and allies, attempting to salvage what remained of her fortune and reputation. Yet each letter, intercepted or discovered by Zara, revealed more desperation than strategy. The woman had become her own undoing, caught in a web of lies and dependency from which there was no escape. As weeks passed, the consequences of Victoria's reckless actions became undeniable. Her debts mounted beyond repair, her property was seized to satisfy creditors, and her influence among Charleston's elite crumbled entirely. Magnolia Grove remained intact, its reputation bolstered by the contrast between the Colonel's integrity and Victoria's ruin. Zara, ever vigilant, understood the importance of continued caution. Victoria's downfall was not a moment, but a process, a slow, inevitable, unraveling fueled by her own mistakes and the careful preparation of those she sought to destroy. Yet within that process, Zara recognized the final truth. Intellect, courage, and strategy could triumph over cruelty, deceit, and the arrogance of inherited privilege. The war was far from over, but the tide had irrevocably turned. Victoria Bowmont, once feared and admired, was now a cautionary tale in the making, a woman undone by her own hubris, a shadow eclipsed by the brilliance of a mind she had once underestimated. Zara and the Colonel stood together, looking over the estate as the sun set, casting long golden shadows across Magnolia Grove. The battle was not yet complete, but the foundations of victory were laid. With patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve, they had turned the first phase of Victoria's war into her final downfall. The war had begun, but now the outcome was clear. The days after Victoria's failed attempts to sway Charleston, society became a tense calm at Magnolia Grove, the kind that heralds storms yet to come. Zara knew that in desperation, Victoria would seek new avenues to reclaim power, but this time, her strategies would backfire even more spectacularly. With careful precision, Zara began compiling every fragment of Victoria's misdeeds, creating a dossier that could not be ignored. Every letter intercepted through the network of house slaves, every overheard conversation, every financial record painstakingly collected over months, was catalogued with unwavering discipline. It began subtly, with small notes sent anonymously to neighbors, merchants, and acquaintances, detailing Victoria's mounting debts and her precarious reliance on opium to maintain her social facade. Names of creditors she had failed to pay were included, along with the amounts owed, all verifiable through public records. Each note was brief, factual, and impossible to refute. Zara watched from the margins, knowing the quiet power of a well-placed truth. Victoria's reaction was immediate. She raged silently at first, smashing teacups in her rosewood drawing room, whispering threats into the air as if anger alone could undo the meticulous records that had begun circulating among her peers. Then, realizing the reach of her enemies, she attempted damage control, writing carefully worded denials and feigning illness to garner sympathy. But each attempt only further exposed her web of deceit. Letters she sent to influential contacts were intercepted by Zara's network, and every contradiction between her words and her documented actions became another nail in the coffin of her reputation. One evening, Zara gathered the colonel in the library, the room bathed in the soft amber glow of oil lamps. "The time has come," she said, spreading out letters, bank statements, and receipts across the table. "Every attempt Victoria makes to salvage herself now provides evidence of her own misconduct. She cannot rebuild from this." The colonel, running a hand through his hair, nodded gravely. "You've turned every weakness she displays into undeniable proof. Her own folly is her enemy. It is astonishing, Zara, how methodical you have become in such a short time." She allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. "It is what one must do when survival depends not on strength alone, but on knowledge and patience. I have seen the kind of destruction ignorance and cruelty can cause. I will not allow it to happen to me or to this plantation." As the exposure of Victoria's secrets spread, whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs became outright gossip in Charleston's elite circles. Merchants refused her requests for credit, neighbors avoided her drawing rooms, and the few allies who had once lent her support quietly withdrew. Every failed transaction, every refusal to help, was quietly documented by Zara, creating a paper trail that left no room for doubt. Victoria's desperation grew palpable. She attempted to discredit Zara personally, spreading lies about impropriety and coercion, but the truth had already taken root. Witnesses from neighboring plantations came forward anonymously, verifying the accuracy of Zara's collected letters and exposing Victoria's opium dependency. Each revelation was a public humiliation, eroding her authority and leaving her isolated in a society that once courted her influence. The decisive moment came when Victoria attempted one final maneuver, a public confrontation at a charity event, hoping to salvage her reputation through theatrics. She wore black silk, her makeup carefully applied, projecting an air of dignified suffering. Yet Zara, forewarned by intelligence gathered from the social network of house slaves, had ensured the presence of individuals who could testify to Victoria's duplicity in a manner that could not be dismissed. As Victoria began her rehearsed speech, outlining supposed concerns about morality and propriety in the South, several letters were read aloud, exposing the exact opposite. The courtroom of society, friends, neighbors, and the elite who had gathered listened as evidence of her corruption, debts, and manipulations filled the room. The effect was immediate: gasps, murmurs, and then silence. Victoria's poised mask of control shattered before their eyes. She attempted to interrupt, to demand that the letters were false, but no one believed her. Each attempt to maintain composure revealed only further panic, and the whispers of disbelief spread like wildfire. Back at Magnolia Grove, Zara and the colonel watched the news arrive through letters from their allies. "She cannot recover from this," the colonel said quietly, reading aloud the accounts of Victoria's public humiliation. "Every move she makes only cements her ruin." Zara nodded. "Her secrets are exposed, and there is no room for salvage. But we must remain vigilant. She is cunning, and desperation can drive people to unpredictable extremes." Victoria's final descent was swift. With creditors demanding repayment, her debts unsustainable, her property seized, and her social network evaporating, she became a figure of scorn rather than envy. Letters from her own hand, previously dismissed or hidden, became public, revealing the depth of her dependence on opium, her manipulations of the legal system, and her financial recklessness. Every revelation reinforced the undeniable truth. She had created her own downfall. Zara, though vigilant, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had turned a position of vulnerability into one of unprecedented strategic advantage. Intelligence, foresight, and patient planning had dismantled a woman whose power had once seemed absolute. Every secret exposed, every lie revealed, was a step toward ultimate security for herself and the Colonel, and for the stability of Magnolia Grove. By the end of the month, Victoria Bowmont was a shadow of the woman she had been. Once feared and admired, she was now desperate, isolated, and under the scrutiny of creditors, neighbors, and the very society she had sought to manipulate. Her fall was not violent, but methodical, inevitable, and entirely of her own making. Zara stood on the veranda of Magnolia Grove, the warm southern wind carrying the faint scent of magnolia blossoms, and reflected on the transformation she had orchestrated. Victoria's exposure was complete. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. No longer a woman hiding behind beauty and status, Victoria was a cautionary tale of arrogance, addiction, and greed. Yet Zara understood that vigilance was eternal. One enemy neutralized was merely a step in the ongoing journey of survival and influence. She and the Colonel had won the battle of exposure, but the war for respect, safety, and legacy required constant awareness, strategy, and courage. And in that quiet, deliberate triumph, Zara felt the profound satisfaction of intellect and preparation, overcoming cruelty and hubris, of secrets revealed and justice achieved not by force of arms, but by the power of mind and principle. The fall of Victoria Bowmont was no longer a question of if, but of how complete it would be. The collapse of Victoria Bowmont was neither sudden nor chaotic. It was a slow, inevitable unraveling, a tapestry of arrogance undone by careful hands. Charleston society, once eager to embrace her beauty and status, now recoiled. Letters chronicling her misdeeds circulated widely, each one meticulously documented by Zara's network of house slaves and allies. The whispers in parlors and salons had grown into undeniable truths. Victoria's opium addiction, financial recklessness, and manipulative schemes were laid bare. The society she had once dominated, now mocking and dismissing her. Victoria attempted to salvage her crumbling empire with frantic desperation. She sold parcels of her land to cover creditors, auctioned furniture and fine art, and even offered her remaining slaves at discounted rates. But the foundation had already cracked. Buyers were wary, merchants refused credit, and neighbors whispered that any investment in her was a gamble. Her once loyal friends avoided her gatherings, leaving her isolated in the grand but hollow halls of Rosewood Plantation. Every decision she made only accelerated her downfall. The legal consequences compounded her misery. With letters proving her orchestration of the fire and her attempt to manipulate the courts, Victoria was arrested on charges of arson, perjury, conspiracy, and fraud. The courtroom proceedings were brutal in their clarity. Witnesses she had trusted, house staff and neighboring planters, testified to her schemes, corroborated by the irrefutable letters and financial records collected by Zara. Each revelation was another hammer striking the fragile veneer of her social image. In the courtroom, Victoria's poise faltered under the relentless weight of evidence. Her elegant attire, once the symbol of dominance and sophistication, now seemed a costume for a farce, a futile attempt to cling to dignity that had long been lost. She screamed, flailed, and begged for mercy. But the jury, composed of men who had once admired her wealth, could no longer see beyond the truth laid bare before them. Outside, Zara observed the unfolding consequences with measured composure. She had not rejoiced in Victoria's humiliation. It was not cruelty that drove her, but a recognition of justice achieved. The woman who had sought to destroy her, to manipulate society, and to enforce a rigid hierarchy through intimidation, was now powerless. The balance of power had shifted entirely. Victoria's personal life became a public spectacle of ruin. Former friends refused correspondence, merchants refused transactions, and every letter she sent to influential figures was intercepted, exposing further contradictions and deception. The debts she had hidden for years were now public knowledge. Her lavish lifestyle, once sustained through secret loans and manipulation, crumbled under the weight of exposure. Even as the legal case progressed, Victoria attempted one final act of defiance, a letter addressed to Charleston's newspapers, denying all accusations and accusing her accusers of conspiracy. But by then, public opinion had irrevocably turned. The newspapers published a factual analysis of the evidence, highlighting the letters, financial records, and testimonies that proved her guilt. The public, once enchanted by her beauty and charm, now scorned her as a cautionary tale of greed and cruelty. Zara and the Colonel remained at Magnolia Grove, vigilant but not idle. The plantation had endured the fire, the threats, and the rumors, but the collapse of Victoria had a stabilizing effect. Social pressure abated, merchants once hesitant to engage with the Colonel now resumed business, and the local network of allies bolstered their standing. Magnolia Grove became a quiet fortress of intellect, strategy, and resilience, a testament to the power of preparation and foresight. Victoria's final days were spent in isolation, her once grand estate reduced to a fraction of its former glory, her social network fractured, and her finances in ruins. She wandered through Charleston like a ghost of her former self. Rumors of her addiction and manipulation circulated freely, with no one to defend her. The society that once celebrated her beauty now whispered only of folly and ruin. When her property was finally seized to satisfy debts, the public spectacle was complete. Auctioneers catalogued her belongings, her land parcels sold to the highest bidder, and her slaves dispersed across plantations far and wide. The woman who had wielded beauty and status as weapons now faced the consequences of her hubris. Every attempt to manipulate the narrative had failed. Every desperate maneuver had accelerated her fall. Zara, reflecting on the culmination of Victoria's downfall, recognized a profound lesson. Power built on cruelty, deceit, and arrogance was inherently unstable. Intelligence, strategy, and the patient accumulation of evidence could dismantle even the most formidable of adversaries. Victoria had underestimated Zara's intellect, her foresight, and her ability to wield knowledge as a weapon. In doing so, she had sown the seeds of her own destruction. The final blow came quietly. Victoria, bankrupt and humiliated, passed away in 1863, consumed by her addiction and isolated from society. Her once celebrated beauty, wealth, and social standing vanished entirely, leaving her as a cautionary tale. In contrast, Zara's victory was measured not only in the downfall of her adversary, but in the establishment of a secure, intellectually grounded life alongside the Colonel. Zara and the Colonel, now fully aligned in purpose and vision, began planning their future together, unbound by the fear of societal scorn. They envisioned Magnolia Grove as a sanctuary of learning, a place where intellect, courage, and strategy could flourish without prejudice. Their partnership, built on mutual respect, understanding, and shared purpose, stood as a testament to what could be achieved when knowledge and determination guided action. The collapse of Victoria Bowmont was complete, a story of arrogance undone by intellect and strategy. For Zara, it was both a victory and a warning. Vigilance, preparation, and courage must always accompany triumph. Yet in the aftermath, the promise of a life built on wisdom and mutual respect offered something far greater than revenge, a legacy of intelligence, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit.